Hey, welcome to week 4 of AP US Government and Politics. Last week we talked about the creation of the US Constitution, but I mentioned after it was created by the delegates in Philadelphia, it was then shipped to all 13 state legislatures for them to debate on it, to look at it, and if they liked it, hopefully ratify and approve of it. But not everyone liked it, and the Constitution wasn't going to be ratified without a fight. This week, we're going to take a look at those debates and discuss the two groups that emerged from those debates, the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist. Let's go. So after we cheated on and ended up breaking it off with the Articles of Confederation,
where shall I go? What shall I do?
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
now the delegates had to come home and explain to mom and dad who the new person was and what happened to the old one. But it was definitely going to take some convincing to get all of these states to accept this brand new document called the Constitution and this brand new government. So some of the men from the convention that proved themselves to be major leaders and big proponents of this Constitution decided to try to convince everyone with argumentative essays. Together, primarily 3 men, James Madison, who would go on to be known as the father of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay would write what became known as the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are a collection of over 80 essays that basically argued in favor of the Constitution. They mostly wrote these essays under the pseudonym Publius. And part of the reason they wrote it under a pseudonym is because they didn't want people focusing on who was writing it. They wanted them to focus on the arguments of it, which is the same reason why I make your annotations and perusal anonymous, so no one can actually see who it is that's writing what. Much like them, I'd rather people focus on what is being written instead of who is writing it. Now, between the 3, it was mostly James Madison and Alexander Hamilton who were writing these Federalist Papers. John Jay wrote a little bit, but like in any group project, he gets a lot of the credit, despite not doing as much. Anyway, these Federalist Papers were written and distributed throughout the states in leaflets and published in newspapers to try to convince people that the Constitution was something that should be ratified. So in AP Government, you have to know 4 of the Federalist Papers: Federalist number 10, Federalist number 51, Federalist 70, and Federalist number 78. Like I said, there's over 80 of these arguments out there, but you need to know the basic arguments of 4 of the papers. Why do you need to know them? Well, when you take the AP exam, you'll be asked to write an argumentative essay. In that argumentative essay, you have to cite evidence from required documents and required Supreme Court cases. So really, this coming week is the bulk of the required documents you're going to have to know. Now, because these are required documents that you need to know, I really recommend that you get out a piece of paper and take notes as I go through each of these required documents. Go ahead and pause that video right now, take out a piece of paper, and you can jot down the title of each paper and then just some of the main ideas and arguments. So let's jump right in and start with Federalist number 10. Federalist number 10 is written by James Madison, and in that essay, Madison argues that the dangers of factions can be mitigated, that's a fancy word for lessened, by a large republic and republican government. So he was advocating for a large constitutional republic, basically a central government that oversaw lots of different diverse groups of people throughout a large area. He feared the danger of a faction, and a faction is basically a group of self-interested individuals who use the government to get what they want, and they may trample on the rights of other people in the process. Now, of course, James Madison was a realist. He knew you could not completely eliminate the cause of factions. It's just human nature for people to group themselves together and try to use government to get what they want. So he knew that that would suppress liberty, trying to eliminate factions altogether. But he did say that a natural check is a large and diverse republic. It helps control the effects of factions with more people, more opinions, and more factions. So let's take a look at a couple excerpts James Madison wrote in Federalist number 10. First of all, Madison says that factions are more difficult to control when they are made up of a majority. According to Madison in Federalist number 10, when a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens, to secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. According to Madison, there were two ways to mitigate the dangers of a faction of a majority. The first is Republican government. He says, as each representative will be chosen by a greater number of citizens in the large than in the small republic, it will be more difficult for unworthy candidates to practice with success the vicious arts by which elections are too often carried. And the suffrages of the people, being more free, will be more likely to center in men who possess the most attractive merit and the most diffusive and established character. Now, if you're thinking, what the heck is this dude talking about? Don't worry, I'll try to explain it in more simple terms. In that first passage there, Madison was talking about the tyranny of the majority, which is basically the idea that groups of people can also abuse the rights of other people just like a king can. Madison's also talking about human nature here. He knows sometimes people get really passionate about something that they want, and they are willing to steamroll anyone and anything to get what they want. It's especially dangerous when you consider the fact that government uses coercion to accomplish things. And think about that really impassioned mob using the violent nature of government to get done whatever they want. Imagine this, you buy like the nicest house on the block. It is your dream home, it's a big mansion, you love it. And then a group of people see that house and decide they want it for themselves. Now, this angry mob loves democracy, so they're gonna do this the democratic way. They're gonna vote on if you get to keep your house or if they get your house through the democratic process of voting. And you know what? They're even nice enough to allow you to vote too. Obviously, you know the outcome of this election. They win the election and they vote for a police officer to come and escort you out of the house. If you refuse, they'll hold a gun to your head and drag you out. Democracy in action. It's kind of a pessimistic view of human nature. But James Madison was a realist, like I said. He knew that you couldn't just get rid of that part of human nature. But Madison also knew that this presented a difficult question. How do you preserve the will of the people in a government? How do you preserve popular sovereignty? Who gets to decide when the majority is either rightly or wrongly doing something? And Madison said part of the problem could be solved if people choose and elect good representatives in a republic as opposed to a direct democracy. Madison also thought that a larger republic with more people would be more likely to elicit good representatives. After all, with more people, you have more choices, not to mention the fact that it's harder for someone to cheat in an election or engage in dirty politics when there's a bigger group of people that are electing them. I mean, think about it. If there's someone running for office and there's 100 voters that get to choose who wins that office, it'd be a heck of a lot easier for one of the candidates to try to give $20 or something to 60 out of the 100 people to secure their vote. But in a much larger republic, that's a heck of a lot harder to manage. Again, Madison's saying in smaller governments where there's not a whole lot of diversity of thought, it's easier for factions to gain power and then suppress the minority. But in a larger republic, Madison's arguing there will be so many different factions all fighting each other for power and competing for political power that it'll be a stalemate and none of them will really be able to dominate the others. The Anti-Federalists were still not convinced. They were worried with a large republic that the government would grow more distant from the people and end up oppressing them. Enter Federalist Paper number 51, where James Madison basically says, I got you guys. We're going to make sure this government can't even oppress people if it wanted to. Now, Madison concedes to the Anti-Federalists that people are not good. They're self-interested. They put their needs above the nation. And Madison famously says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government, which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. So to summarize that argument by Madison, he's basically saying, yes, people are bad and people do end up controlling the government. So Madison's remedy was separation of powers, federalism, and checks and balances. To him, these were the keys to preventing tyranny, and they would be built into the structure of the government. Now, hopefully you remember last week when we talked about separation of powers and checks and balances and how those two principles of American government try to prevent there from being any centralized authority that could be tyrannical. But let's take a look at what Madison is saying when it comes to federalism. He's saying, furthermore, a federal system in which power is separated between the national government and the states would provide an important defense against the dangers of tyranny. In Federalist 51, he says, in the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among the distinct and separate departments. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. What's he saying there? Well, let's imagine that this is you. And this hammer here is the tyranny of a bad government that's out to abuse your rights. Madison is saying that the separation of powers and checks and balances already in the national government is enough to protect you from being abused by tyranny. But Madison's also saying if you don't think that this and checks and balances and separation of powers in the national government is enough to keep you safe, you have another layer that the tyranny has to get through in order to abuse your rights, the state government. So, hence a double security arises to the rights of the people. In Federalist number 51, Madison also returns to the argument he made in Federalist number 10 about the importance of having multiple factions compete in the policymaking process. In Federalist number 51, he writes, in a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. It consists in the one case in the multiplicity of interest, and in the other in the multiplicity of sex. The degree of security in both cases will depend on the number of interest and sex, and this may be presumed to depend on the extent of country and number of people comprehended under the same government. Now, Madison's argument here is often compared to the crab in a bucket mentality. If you've ever seen crabs in a bucket, you'll know the moment one of the crabs tries to escape from the top of the bucket, the other crabs immediately pull it back down so that it's still in the bucket.
Crab mentality. Hold each other down. Nobody ever makes it out. Nothing like it. Look at them fighting. You ain't getting out. If I can't get out, you can't get out.
It's really a brilliant illustration for how Madison sees branches and factions fighting one another to keep each other in check and within the proper realm of power. Now, the Anti-Federalists were still really concerned about this new independent executive because now there's going to be a single person that wields all of the violent power of government. And to them, this was the prime suspect about where tyranny would come from. As I had previously mentioned, a great deal of people actually wanted there to be a council of executives, like maybe 3 executives, so that that power was divided up. In Federalist number 70, Alexander Hamilton writes in defense of this new single independent executive position called the presidency. Hamilton first goes after the idea that there should be multiple presidencies by taking a lesson from Roman history. Later in the Roman Empire, there were actually co-emperors. And from Hamilton's view, this helped lead to the dissolution of the Roman Empire because things got confusing and no one knew who to blame when things went wrong. For example, if you're on a ship with 3 different captains and they're all trying to get the boat to go in different directions, things get really confusing. Hamilton basically says, look, if we really want to hold the executive accountable, we have to know who's making the decision. If there's 3 executives and a horrible decision is made, they're all going to blame each other so that they're not the one that gets voted out of office by the people. So Hamilton makes a strong case why the buck should just stop at one person for the purpose of accountability. Because as the Romans learned, things get confusing when you're not exactly sure who to blame.
I'm Spartacus! 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 I'm Spartacus!
The Anti-Federalists were also concerned over the fact that the president had the power to single-handedly veto legislation. I mean, that's a lot of power for one person. But Hamilton's like, no, it's good, it's good. Here's why. Because the executive needs to have the power to stand up to the craziness of the legislative branch. Because the legislative branch is the closest to the people. It's the closest thing you're going to get to a mob or the tyranny of the majority. And the president needs to be able to stand up to it and stop it if it gets out of check. So this all leads to the fact that Hamilton wants an energetic executive, an executive with power, a single executive that all eyes go to. He didn't want this executive to be weak. He wanted them to be strong and have enough power to make clear unilateral decisions. Hamilton also wanted the executive to serve for life. Now, if you're thinking, gosh, that sounds an awful lot like a king, well, that's what the Anti-Federalists felt. Thankfully, someone at the Constitutional Convention decided to make that 4 years instead of a lifetime term. After all, a lot of people were thinking, hey, knucklehead, did we not just fight a revolution to get rid of being ruled by a king? But no. Hamilton loves power, and he loves elite people that are well-educated having power for a long time. And he doesn't really trust the common people to actually make wise decisions when it comes to politics. This leads us to the second exhibition of Hamilton's elitist ideas, Federalist number 78, which takes a look at the judicial branch and makes the case for an independent judiciary with the Supreme Court. After receiving some criticism from the anti-Federalists, particularly out of Brutus number 1, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, Hamilton writes Federalist number 78 in support of an independent judicial branch. He advocates for a judicial branch with the power of judicial review. And remember, judicial review is the ability for a court to look at a law to see if it's constitutional or not and to strike it down if it's contrary to the Constitution. This was officially established in Marbury versus Madison in 1803. To Hamilton, having an independent judicial branch that could slap the wrist of Congress or the president if they're acting outside of the Constitution was just another added check and balance to prevent there from being a tyrannical government that abuses the rights of the people. To ensure that judges were actually doing their job of judicial review, Hamilton argued that judges should serve for life. There's that life term again popping up. But this time people agreed with Alexander Hamilton. People thought that the judges needed to be independent of the people to stop the tyranny of the majority. They wanted judges to be insulated from external pressure. And a lot of times external pressure comes from elections. You all know every election cycle, politicians promise people what they want to hear. Well, judges can't really do that because their job is to judge the law based off of what the Constitution says to see if it's constitutional or not. If judges were running for elections, then they might feel pressure to promise people things and then deliver on those promises while completely ignoring what the Constitution says and what the law says. Last year in my classes, I did a little thought experiment. I decided to have people run for judge of Candyland, and people would promise the class that they would give them a certain type of candy if they voted for them. After they were elected judge, I had them look at the Candyland Constitution, which said that only Kit Kats could be distributed in Candyland. Despite this, some of the judges still said they were going to deliver the candy that they had promised the electorate. Some judges, on the other hand, said that they were going to respect the Constitution. However, it looks like they completely lied to the people that voted them in. So from Hamilton's view, judges running for elections is an automatic conflict of interest. That's why to this day, Supreme Court justices serve for life. But you better believe the anti-federalists were going to be freaked out when they learned that a small group of people could dictate if a law was okay or not okay for an entire lifetime. I mean, isn't that kind of an oligarchy? But Hamilton said, whoa, guys, rest assured, the judicial branch is the weakest branch of all three branches. They can't tax, they can't spend, or use the sword of the executive. Again, Hamilton's referring to the coercive nature of the executive branch of government, the one branch of government that actually uses threats of violence to get people to do things. The judicial branch can't actually enforce any of its rulings. Famously, the judicial branch and Chief Justice John Marshall struck down Andrew Jackson's Trail of Tears, you may remember learning about in history class. Andrew Jackson simply ignored the court. He said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. He completely ignored the court and went on with it anyway. Also remember with Little Rock 9 that Dwight D. Eisenhower had to actually send in the military to enforce desegregation in Arkansas, who refused to actually implement the Supreme Court's ruling. So any decision the Supreme Court and the judicial branch makes, they have to rely on the executive to actually follow through with the implementation of that ruling. And yes, the executive can, if they choose to, just completely ignore the judicial branch. Is it wrong if they do? Yeah. But can they? Yeah, because they're the ones with the guns. So we've talked about the Federalist Papers, but there were a whole other set of argumentative essays written by the anti-Federalists who were against the Constitution to try to convince states not to ratify it and stick with the Articles of Confederation. The first one we'll take a look at is called Brutus number 1. Brutus 1 was written under a pseudonym just like the Federalists did with the name Publius, though we're not exactly sure who wrote Brutus 1. There are some different theories out there. But Brutus was chosen as a pseudonym because if you remember from the story of Julius Caesar, Brutus was the one who thought Caesar had turned into a tyrant and became too powerful and wanted to assassinate him to try to return Rome to its glory days as a republic. In Brutus number 1, you're going to notice that the tone of the author throughout the entire document is one that is suspicious of power. They believe the country is way too large to be governed as a republic. They think that smaller governments are far more efficient at governing the people people because they're closer to the people and they know the people far better. They're more representative of the people because they're from a smaller location. I mean, think about it when it comes to classes. In a big class with 30 students, you may not have as good of a relationship with your teacher as you might in a classroom with only 10 or 15 students. Now, I can tell you as a teacher, in classes with 10 or 15 students, I have a lot more time to spend one-on-one with each of the students and get to know them and give them more one-on-one time to help them. In a class of 30, that's a lot of students. I can't always get around to everyone to help them and get to know them. In smaller classes, I'm able to cater my teaching style to the students because I know them a little bit better. I'm also able to grade and give feedback faster, and I'm also able to discipline students a lot more efficiently. To the anti-federalists, a national government is going to be far more detached from the people. The farther detached it is from the people, the more likely it is to abuse the rights of the people, and the harder it is for the people to actually keep the government in check if it does start abusing their rights. Not to mention, your national government representatives aren't quite as accessible as your state representatives. For example, you are just one of 800,000 people that are represented by Troy Balderson, who's our representative to the U.S. House of Representatives. He represents everyone here in District 12. Your 2 U.S. senators, you are one of 11 million people they represent. So they're definitely not quite as accessible. That means when your U.S. senators are up for re-election, they've got to really try to consider the views of millions of people compared to your U.S. House representative trying to understand the views of a few 100,000 people. Compare that to your representative in the Ohio House of Representatives. You are one of only 100,000 people. Compare that to city councilmen where you're maybe one of 15,000 people in the city. I think you get the idea. I didn't really think it was fair that a majority of people in one region of the country who are probably very different from people in the far other region of the country would be passing laws that impact those other people. So, for example, they didn't really think it would be fair today if people from California were making laws that impacted people in rural Alabama and vice versa. After all, people of a like mind tend to stick together. It's no surprise that you often see Democrats elected in cities and Republicans elected out in the countryside. So if you've ever thought to yourself, why don't we just take all the liberals and move them to one area and let them create their own government and do their own thing, and take all the conservatives and move them to one area, let them make their own government and do their own thing so they're not constantly fighting each other, then you might be an anti-federalist. We're Patrick Starr.
We should take Bikini Bottom and push it somewhere else!
The Anti-Federalists were also really concerned about the excess of power in the Constitution. For example, the power to tax. There's a reason they didn't give the central government the power to tax under the Articles of Confederation. They had experienced what it was like to have a centralized government tax them, and they saw that it became tyrannical. They also didn't like the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution, also known as the elastic clause, because they thought that that gave Congress way too much power. They could turn around and do anything and then say, well, it's necessary and proper for us to do it. They thought basically that was a blank check for Congress to do whatever they wanted. They were also concerned over the supremacy clause. If you're going to have a federal government where states have some rights, why would you have a clause in the Constitution that says that the Constitution and the laws of the federal government are the supreme law of the land? That basically means any time the states might conflict with the Constitution or the federal government, you're giving the federal government the go-ahead. Also didn't like the idea of a federal judiciary. They were worried that a group of people making decisions on what was constitutional and what wasn't for an entire nation was pretty much an oligarchy. They were also concerned over military control and the fact that under this central government, it was far easier for Congress to raise and maintain an army and a navy. They had seen the destruction of liberty and the prevalence of tyranny under the British when their standing army busted down doors and forced people to order them in their homes. They also weren't big fans of the Commerce Clause either, because they feared someday Congress would try to intervene in the affairs of a state and maybe even intervene in the affairs of individuals and turn around and claim that they were regulating commerce because the actions of the individuals affected commerce and business. This new constitution, they felt, rendered the states essentially meaningless. For example, the author of Brutus I wrote, "It is a truth confirmed by the unerring experience of the ages that every man and every body of men invested with power are ever disposed to increase it and to acquire a superiority over everything that stands in their way. This disposition, which is implanted in human nature, will operate in the federal legislature to lessen and ultimately to subvert the state authority. And having such advantages will most certainly succeed if the federal government succeeds at all. He's basically saying that the history of human nature shows that once people get power, they want to increase it. And this is undoubtedly going to be reflected in the federal government. Brutus wasn't wrong at all. Using the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause, the federal government has grown to a point where states really don't have nearly as much power as they used to. Using the commerce clause, Congress has now justified their ability to stop someone from selling raw milk to someone else just a couple houses down the road. That's a major increase in power. It's exactly what Brutus was afraid of and predicted would happen. Brutus 1 ends with a desperate plea to reject the proposed constitution and save the power of the states. He says, though I am of opinion that it is a sufficient objection to this government to reject it, that it creates the whole union into one government under the form of a republic. Yet if this objection was obviated, there are exceptions to it, which are so material and fundamental that they ought to determine every man who is a friend to the liberty and happiness of mankind not to adopt it. As the battle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists raged on, some of the Federalists said, you know what, Anti-Federalists, we're going to strike a deal with you. We know you're really concerned over the preservation of individual liberties, and we hear you on that. So they proposed what's called the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was a list of rights and liberties that governments cannot take away. Most of the state constitutions had them, but they weren't considered necessary by the Federalists for the federal government. They felt the government was already limited. It's got checks and balances, separation of powers, not to mention the people are already sovereign. So if they feel their rights are being abused, they can just elect a new government and kick those people out of office. Plus, they were also afraid that the Bill of Rights might not be comprehensive, meaning there might be other rights that the Bill of Rights forgets to include in there. And if it's not included in there, then maybe that's assuming that the government can do that. For example, it would be like, we made an agreement that I couldn't punch you, but that agreement didn't say anything about me not kicking you, and then I proceed to kick you in the face. The Anti-Federalists said this was necessary to check the tendency of government to infringe on individual liberties and the rights of the citizens. So in 1791, the 10 amendments were finally added to the U.S. Constitution. This is what got many of the Anti-Federalists to go ahead and vote in favor of the Constitution, as long as this was a part of it. And the Constitution was ratified by all 13 states, with Rhode Island finally kicking up the rear end in 1791. There were at least some close battles. For example, in New York, it was only passed by 3 votes. Despite the fact that the Constitution was ratified by all 13 states and became the law of the land, the battle over the Constitution really set the stage for the first 2 political parties in American history: the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, who would later become known as the Democratic Republicans. There you have it. We just briefly went over quite a few of your required documents for this course. So this week for your assignments, I'm going to do things a little bit differently. Instead of having you outline chapter 3, we're going to take a break from the chapter outlines, and instead you're going to have to do perusal annotations on these required documents. It's a required part of the course that you read through the documents and that you take notes on them. So I want that to be your focus this week, because it is a lot of reading and it's a lot of documents. So your perusal outlines for this week will go over the Federalist Papers and Brutus 1, as well as maybe a couple other of your required documents, and those will all be due by Friday. Of course, this Edpuzzle will be due on Wednesday like normal. As always, let me know if you need anything. I'll see you in the comments section on perusal, and have a great week.